once upon a time, in a kingdom draped in velvet twilight, there lived a knight named Sir Gideon. His armor gleamed like polished silver, and his sword shimmered with the courage of 100 battles. Children in the village whispered tales of his bravery, how he faced fire-breathing dragons and outsmarted cunning trolls without so much as a flinch. But Sir Gideon had a secret, one he kept tucked beneath his chest plate. He was afraid of the dark. Every night, when the last candle flickered out and shadows stretched across his chamber, his heart would pound like a drum at battle's edge. A tiny nightlight, shaped like a shield, glowed faithfully by his bedside, casting just enough light to keep the gloom at bay. He told himself it was silly. A knight shouldn't need such comforts, but the dark felt heavier than his armor, and twice as cold. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon like a golden coin into a well, a messenger arrived with urgent news. The king's youngest daughter had wandered into the forbidden Enchanted Forest, where the trees grew so thick they swallowed the moonlight whole. Only the bravest knight can bring her home, the messenger declared, and all eyes turned to Sir Gideon. His hands trembled around his sword hilt, not at the thought of danger, but of the endless dark between those ancient trees. Yet, a true knight's duty is not to be fearless, but to face fear with honor. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his nightlight shield on his belt, where others carried flints or daggers, and stepped into the gathering dusk. The Enchanted Forest loomed before Sir Gideon like a wall of whispered secrets. The trees stood tall and ancient, their gnarled branches knitting together so tightly that even the boldest rays of twilight couldn't pierce through. A chill wind slithered between the trunks, carrying the scent of damp earth and something older, something that made the tiny nightlight on his belt flicker nervously. Gideon tightened his grip on his sword, its familiar weight anchoring him. He had faced dragons, yes, and trolls, and even a particularly disagreeable wyvern, but none of them filled him with the same quiet dread as the thought of stepping into that endless dark. He hesitated just for a heartbeat, then reached down and tapped the nightlight. Its soft glow steadied, casting a trembling circle of light around his boots. Enough, he told himself. A knight does not falter at shadows. With that, he stepped forward. Leaves crunched underfoot, the sound impossibly loud in the unnatural hush of the forest. The branches above creaked like old bones, and Gideon could have sworn they shifted to close the path behind him. There would be no turning back. Soft laughter trickled through the trees, high, melodic, and just a little mocking. Gideon turned sharply, but the light from his nightlight barely reached beyond his own outstretched hand. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steadier than he felt. The laughter came again, closer this time, and then a whisper of fabric, a flicker of movement at the edge of his sight. Suddenly, a figure darted across his path, small, barefoot, a flash of golden hair. the princess. Gideon broke into a run, the darkness pressing in around him like a living thing. The nightlight's glow swung wildly as he stumbled over roots knotted like sleeping serpents. He could hear the princess ahead of him, her footsteps light and quick, always just out of reach. "Wait," he called, but she didn't slow. Then, without warning, the forest opened into a small clearing, or at least, it should have been small. But the space stretched impossibly wide, the tree line receding into blackness. In the center stood a single, towering oak, its trunk split wide open like a hungry maw. And there, at its base, stood the princess. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't even moving. She was staring up at the tree, her face pale in the dim light, her eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear. And then Gideon saw it, the thing that had rooted her to the spot. From the deepest hollow of the oak, two glowing eyes blinked open. They weren't human. They weren't animal. They were hungry. Gideon's breath caught. His nightlight flickered wildly, its light thinning to a frail gasp. The shadows stretched longer. The air grew colder. Whatever lived in that tree wasn't just waiting. It was waking up. And Gideon, for all his shining armor and well-worn courage, had never felt so small or so very, very afraid of the dark. Sir Gideon's sword felt impossibly heavy as he forced his feet forward, the nightlight's trembling glow barely holding back the encroaching dark. The princess still hadn't moved, her golden hair dull in the unnatural twilight of the clearing. The thing in the tree, the thing with eyes like smoldering coals, let out a sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite words, but something in between. It slithered into Gideon's ears and settled cold against his bones. "Princess," he called, his voice cracking. "Step away from the tree." She didn't turn, didn't blink. The thing's gaze held her fast. Gideon's armor creaked as he took another step, his pulse thundering in his throat. Shadows pooled around the oak's roots, twining up the bark like creeping vines. The nightlight flickered again, its glow shrinking to a scant handful of light. He could feel the dark pressing in, thick and suffocating, as if the forest itself were breathing down his neck. Then the princess spoke. "They're watching," she whispered, her voice far away and dreamlike. "Can't you see them?" Gideon followed her gaze and froze. The hollow of the tree wasn't empty. Dozens more pairs of eyes blinked open, glimmering in the depths, each set fixed unblinkingly on the princess. No, not just watching, drinking her in. The air hummed with a low, insistent hunger, and Gideon suddenly understood. She wasn't lost. She'd been lured. "Get back." He lunged forward, grabbing her arm just as the first shadow detached itself from the tree, a tendril of living darkness, slick and shapeless. It lashed out, snagging the hem of the princess's gown with a sound like tearing silk. Gideon yanked her backward, and the fabric ripped free, disintegrating into wisps of black smoke. The forest reacted instantly. The ground trembled. The branches overhead groaned and twisted, sealing the clearing like a cage. From the oak's hollow, the shadows poured forth in a terrible, roiling wave, their eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Gideon did the only thing he could think of. He shoved the princess behind him and raised his sword. The blade flashed as it met the first shadow, slicing clean through the darkness. A shriek split the air, high and keening, and the shadow recoiled, its form rippling like disturbed water. For a heartbeat, Gideon dared to hope. Then the rest descended. They came in a rush, cold, grasping hands that slithered over his armor, seeking cracks, seams, any way in. The nightlight flared bright as Gideon swung wildly. But for every shadow he dispersed, two more took its place. One coiled around his wrist, yanking his sword arm down with impossible strength. Another wrapped around his throat, thin and choking as a noose. The princess screamed. Gideon's vision darkened at the edges. His knees hit the ground. The shadows pressed closer, whispering in voices that weren't voices at all, just hunger-given sound. And then a spark, small, bright. The nightlight at his belt blazed to life, its light exploding outward in a radiant burst. The shadows shrieked as the glow burned through them, their forms unraveling like threadbare cloth. The clearing lit up, sudden and stark, revealing the truth of the oak. Its trunk wasn't just split, it was hollow, a doorway. And beyond it, nothing but endless dark. Gideon staggered to his feet, gasping. The remaining shadows hissed at the edges of the light, coiling just beyond its reach. The princess clutched his cloak, her fingers trembling. "That's where they came from," she breathed. Gideon knew what he had to do. "Stay close to the light," he ordered, shifting the nightlight to his free hand. Then, before he could second-guess it, he stepped toward the hollow. The shadows surged, but the light held them back. Gideon lifted the nightlight high, its glow pushing against the hungry dark like a shield. The oak's interior yawned before them, a tunnel of black so absolute it made his stomach twist. And then he heard it. From deep within the hollow, a new sound, soft at first, then growing. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Something was coming. The princess whimpered. Gideon tightened his grip on his sword. The shadows at the edges of the light quivered, their eyes widening, not in hunger this time, but something like anticipation. Then, from the darkness, a shape emerged. Tall, pale, its limbs too long, its movements too smooth. It stepped into the dim edge of the nightlight's glow, and Gideon's breath caught. Its face was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just emptiness. And yet, he knew it was smiling. "Little night," it crooned, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "You brought a light." Gideon's blood turned to ice. The thing reached out, one skeletal hand, unfurling toward the nightlight, toward their only hope. And as the shadows laughed in the dark, Gideon realized with dreadful certainty, this was no monster he could fight with steel. This was fear itself, given form, and it wanted the light. The skeletal fingers hovered inches from the nightlight's glow, and Gideon's breath came in ragged gasps. Around them, the shadows seethed, pressing closer, not attacking, but waiting, watching. The princess dug her fingers into Gideon's cloak, her trembling warmth a stark contrast to the cold leaching from the hollow tree. "Give it to me," the faceless thing murmured, its voice slithering through the still air like smoke. The nightlight flickered in response, its glow dimming ever so slightly. Gideon's sword arm shook. Every instinct screamed to fight, to slash at the creature, to drive it back. But the weight in his chest held him frozen. This wasn't a battle of steel. Shadows couldn't be cut. Darkness couldn't be wounded. And yet he adjusted his grip on the nightlight, feeling the warmth of its metal casing against his palm. It was small, so small. A child's comfort, not a knight's weapon. But in this moment, it was all they had. The creature's hand twitched closer. When Gideon didn't move, it laughed, a sound like dry leaves scattering across stone. It breathed. "You think it's yours?" The princess let out a whimper. Gideon couldn't blame her. The thing's words coiled around his thoughts, whispering doubts he'd carried for years. Who are you to stand against the dark? You who tremble at nightfall. You who needs a little light like a babe, needs a rattle. The nightlight dimmed further than movement. A shadow, quicker than the rest, darted past Gideon's defenses and seized the princess's wrist. She screamed as its touch blackened her skin, tendrils of darkness snaking up her arm. Gideon roared and swung his sword, but it passed harmlessly through the shadow, meeting no resistance. The faceless thing tilted its head. "You see," it said softly. Panic clawed up Gideon's throat. The princess's knees buckled as the dark spread, her golden hair dulling to ash. Around them, the other shadows pulsed hungrily, drinking in her fear, her fading light. And Gideon understood. This wasn't just about his fear. The dark fed on all of it, every whispered terror, every unspoken doubt. That was its power. Its truth, the nightlight guttered. Almost gone now, the creature leaned in. "Last chance, little knight." Gideon closed his eyes. For the first time since he'd stepped into this cursed forest, he stopped fighting the fear. He let it in. Let it twist in his chest like a living thing. And as he did, he remembered the way the village children's faces lit up when he told them stories. How the princess had trusted him to find her. The warmth of the nightlight in his hand, not a shameful crutch, but a choice. A stand against the dark. His eyes snapped open. "No," he said. And then he pushed not with his sword, but with something deeper, something brighter. The nightlight flared in his grasp, its glow erupting outward in a brilliant corona. The shadows shrieked as light washed over them, their forms dissolving like ink in water. The faceless thing recoiled, its hollow face twisting in something like shock as the radiance burned its reaching fingers to smoke. The princess gasped as the darkness retreated from her skin, color rushing back into her cheeks. Gideon didn't hesitate. He grabbed her hand and thrust the nightlight between them and the creature, its light now blazing like a tiny sun. The forest trembled. The hollow tree groaned, its bark splitting further as the light poured into its depths, scouring the shadows from within. The faceless thing writhed, its smooth features rippling, and for one terrible instant, Gideon saw it change, saw something flicker across that empty canvas, not a face, but the memory of one. Then, with a sound like shattered glass, it fractured and was gone. Silence. The clearing lay still, bathed in the nightlight's steady glow. Gone were the clutching shadows, the whispering hunger. Even the ancient oak seemed smaller, just a tree again. The princess squeezed Gideon's hand. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than he expected. "You did it," she whispered. Gideon looked at the nightlight still shining, still warm. He swallowed hard. "No," he said, "we did." And together they turned toward the path home. Beyond the trees, the first hints of dawn painted the sky. But beneath his armor, Gideon's heart still raced. Because he knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that the dark wasn't truly gone. It was just waiting. And next time, it wouldn't underestimate the light. The descent back through the Enchanted Forest should have been easier, with dawn creeping over the horizon. Yet the trees seemed to press closer, their gnarled branches clutching at Gideon's cloak like grasping fingers. The princess kept close, her small hand tight around his. But even her presence couldn't ease the prickling dread along his spine. The nightlight flickered weakly at his belt, its glow now a dim pulse rather than the radiant sunburst that had shattered the faceless creature. Gideon touched it absently, his stomach twisting. Had it always been this faint? A twig snapped somewhere to their left. Gideon spun, sword drawn, but only shadows stirred between the blackened trunks. Then whispers, not the hissing taunts of before, but voices. Familiar ones. Sir Gideon the Fearful, murmured the wind through the leaves, and his breath caught. Pathetic, sighed the rustling bracken. The princess tugged his arm. "Don't listen," she pleaded, but the words slithered into his ears, taking root. Ahead, the path split. To the right, golden light shimmered the village gates. To the left, a narrow trail vanished into impenetrable gloom. And standing at the fork, half hidden in the mist, was a figure in tarnished armor. Gideon's blood turned to ice. The figure lifted its visor. His own face stared back, eyes hollow, mouth twisted in a sneer. "Run home, little knight," his reflection whispered, "before the dark remembers you." The nightlight guttered out. Around them, the shadows began to laugh. The end.